Let's get started. Okay, so on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, which is a part of the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies series. I will be your host this afternoon. My name is Jared McBride. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at UCLA. Our guest today, Professor Robin Judd, will speak about her recent book, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. We will have copies of the book, which you can see here, available for purchase after the event at the back tables. We hope you can join us at many more Levy Center events this year. You'll see some flyers, or whatever's left of the events this year. You'll see some flyers at the back of the room as well. I'd like to thank, as always, the Levy Center staff, which is an incredible staff for making the arrangements for today's event happen. And please take a moment to silence your phones. So, in the wake of the Shoah, Jewish survivors faced an enormous task of starting their lives anew. In the ruins of a shattered Germany, many found themselves in displaced persons camps, healing, planning, and waiting for next steps. From many popular works on this theme, we of course know the general framework of the story. Survivors from across Europe came together in these DP camps and began the work of reconstituting their lives, figuring out where to go, and eventually ending up boarding airplane ships to new destinations like the United States and Israel, where a new chapter would begin. Today's talk, however, illuminates a lesser-known chapter from the story: Jewish women who married military personnel in the months and years after the war and immigrated to places like the US, Canada, and the UK to start their new lives with their new spouses. In her most recent book, historian Robin Judd takes the readers into the lives of these Jewish women and their extraordinary journeys from the Holocaust to their new homes. So I should say not always to the home they expected, illuminating each stop along the way, courtship to marriage to the immigration process to immersion in a new homeland. Throughout this gripping book, Judd attends to both the larger complex institutional bureaucratic history of how these marriages came to be allowed by allied governments and how the complex immigration process unfolded, while also delicately dealing with the questions of guilt, grief, and belonging through a series of survivors' vignettes, including one special vignette at the end, which maybe I will not mention in the intro. It's a book that beautifully captures the in-betweenness of these two worlds and all of the choices, decisions, and strokes of fate that took these women from one world to the next. And for introduction to our speaker, Professor Robin Judd is a professor of history at The Ohio State University, where she teaches courses in Holocaust studies, the history of anti-Semitism, the history of leadership, and directs the Hoffman Leaders in Leadership and History program. She's the author of Contested Rituals, Circumcision, Kosher Butchering, and the German Jewish Political Life in Germany, 1843 to 1933, and of course, most recently, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust, which garnered 2 National Jewish Book Awards and was named a finalist for the 2024 Ohioana Nonfiction Award. In recognition of her work in Holocaust studies, Governor DeWine has appointed her to Ohio's Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission in 2021, and Professor Judd is the Vice Chair of the Leo Baeck Institute's Faculty Advisory Board and past President of the Association for Jewish Studies. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Judd. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jared, and thank you all for inviting me here today and for giving me this opportunity to speak to really one of my favorite kinds of audiences, which is where we have people from the community as well as people from the academy, because as we'll kind of talk about a little bit today, that was my vision when I was writing this book. So let's see. There you go. So today I hope that we'll do 3 things, and I promised David that I would not move too much, so I'm going to try my best to stay in one place. But today I'm going to try to do 3 things. First, I'm just going to give a little bit of a brief introduction to what we mean by war brides, what that concept is. Then we'll talk a little bit about why Jewish brides, and we'll spend most of our time together today looking at the arc of the book And to do so, we'll dive into sort of two couples, Flore and Hara, Abe and Sala. So to begin, the concept of the war bride, namely what happens when a military personnel member wishes to marry someone abroad, is not at all a new concept. This is a category that really has its roots in the ancient period, and indeed many of our legal structures, whether we're thinking about the British and Commonwealth legal system or the American legal system or several of the different European legal systems, have sort of notions of what it means when a military personnel wishes to marry abroad, what that looks like, who it is that should give permission, what that marriage should look like in terms of its officiating, and then who's responsible for the caring of those brides. And in the American and Canadian contexts, the term war bride sort of gets raised with some sort of frequency in the late 19th century, becomes a category of real meaning during the First World War. In the British context, it's much older. But whatever we're talking about, whether it's the UK or it's Canada or it's the United States, during the Second World War, the numbers explode. So in the First World War, the numbers are quite significant, but it's in the Second World War that we begin to look at sort of hundreds of thousands of military personnel requesting permission to marry individuals abroad. Now, these are almost exclusively non-Jews, right? These are non-Jewish military personnel who are most frequently looking to marry non-Jewish civilians. My interest in the Jewish war brides, and I had been interested sort of in war brides more generally. I work in gender history and this sort of intersection of gender history and Jewish history. But my interest in Jewish war brides sort of had two origin stories. And one origin story is a very personal one, and it's the one that I talk about in that last sort of chapter in the conclusion of the book. I should say as an aside, even though I've spent a quarter of my quarter century in Ohio, I still speak like a New Yorker. So if at any point people need me to slow down, just sort of wave at me. But one part of the story is a very personal story, right? And that is that fabulous photo up in the top left corner with the woman who's wearing a patterned sweater. I did not do this on purpose, but I'm noticing that I did choose a blouse that resembles my grandmother's. So that's my grandmother at her Americanization class. My grandmother was a Jewish war bride. And she often presented her story as unique. My grandmother and father were the only survivors of their family. They both survived the war in hiding. My grandmother would speak about her life up until about 1942. She was in Slovakia, so that 42 made sense. She would speak about her life up until 1942 when my father was born, and then she would pick up with her life in about 1950 or so. She did not want to talk about her experiences during the war, nor did she talk about her experiences as a war bride. There were some bits and pieces that she shared with me, and indeed, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, when I started doing the research for the book, sort of alongside the research for the book, I began researching my own family history, and that itself had its own elements of complications of what does it mean to begin to unearth sort of a family narrative. And there are some of you in this room who really kind of have done a lot more of that work than I have. So that was sort of the personal piece. The less personal piece kind of is spoken to by the rest of the images here, namely when I was teaching, or when I started teaching at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. One of the first courses I taught was History of the Holocaust. And I always wanted to introduce a memoir written by a woman alongside a memoir written by a man. And so the first memoir that I used was Gerda Weissman Klein's All But My Life. Many of you probably know of this memoir, and she ends her memoir meeting the man that she will eventually marry. And it was really teaching that book again that I sort of remembered the book from my earlier years of reading it as a high schooler. I had kind of forgotten about it. I had forgotten that she had met her husband at the very end of the memoir. And with that, I began to sort of pull other early published memoirs out, right? So Leisha Rose's The Tulips Are Red is the first memoir written by a female survivor published in Canada. She ends her memoir meeting her future husband literally in the lines of fighting. Leisha was a member of the Partisans. Gina Turgell's I Light a Candle is one of two memoirs published around the same time. Also a survivor who ends her memoir meeting her future husband in Bergen-Belsen, and so on and so forth. Like, I started pulling some of these memoirs off the shelves. I just include two other here, Seed of Sarah and Lala's Story. And of course, there's the Hannah Kuhner episode of the television show This Is Your Life, which is the television show that in many ways introduces a female survivor to an American public in the 1950s. And Hannah Kuhner is also a Jewish war bride. The show This Is Your Life has 3 survivors that they interview over the course of the 1950s. 2 of them are war brides, and Hannah is a female Jewish war bride. The second war bride, Gregor, is a male war bride. And indeed, one could be, during the Second World War, a male war bride. So in the First World War, the verbiage around the war bride was explicitly gendered in all of its implications and ramifications. Clearly, if we're using the language of war bride, it's gendered. However, one could be a male war bride, and there's a great late 1940s film that stars Cary Grant, nothing to do with Jews, called I Was a Male War Bride. So the concept of the male war bride is a concept in the late 40s and early 1950s, so it's not surprising that the television show This Is Your Life would have a male war bride as one of its interviewees. So it was kind of reading these memoirs and integrating those memoirs and the television show with my grandmother's experience that made me think, as I moved from that kind of wonderful moment when one moves from the end of the first book towards the second book, right? Where the first book is the book that hopefully, please God, right, will get you tenure. And the second book, one has a bit more freedom to kind of think about kind of timing. And may we all hope and that we continue to live in a world where scholars will have that freedom to continue to do the kinds of work that they can do for their second book. So I knew for my second book that I was interested in these Jewish war brides. I recognized that I was going to be moving significantly from the 19th and early 20th century to the mid-20th century, that there would be new literatures that I would need to read, and that it would take me to a number of different countries and have the opportunity to work in a number of different languages. And happy to kind of get into the weeds in the Q&A about the research process. But as I started to do the research, it became clear to me that there was a story with these Jewish brides, that there was something unique, and that there was a reason to delve deeply into these Jewish women and men who marry American, British, and Canadian military personnel. And I don't have Russian, so I was not able and chose not to look at those war brides. There are other good reasons not to do so, which is that in the 1943 determination around war bride and fraternization policy, the Soviet Union kind of pursues its own path. So I looked at a sort of a legal group of women and men that would be considered the same, in the same way or in the same vein. So it becomes clear to me that that there are a couple of different ways that the studying of these Jewish women and men, right, Holocaust survivors who are in Nazi-occupied Europe in the aftermath of the war and meet and eventually will marry these members of the military personnel, that they sort of shed light on Holocaust histories. And first of all, and here it speaks to a shift that we see in sort of the study of the post-World War II period more generally, right, that understands and imagines this liberation period, this reconstruction and recovery period as much messier than we may have envisioned it 20 years ago, right? And certainly the men and women that I study really kind of highlight the unevenness, the sometimes sort of deep despair and unhappiness of that immediate post-war period. And there's a way in which, even in their memoirs, we see that reified. And in the Q&A, we can talk about sort of what happens when one is looking at different kinds of ego documents, right? Materials, letters, diaries from the 1940s, and then, you know, the same individual giving interviews in the 90s or the early 2000s. The second thing that I try to talk about in the book, and that I think the Jewish war brides give us access to, is the difficulty of survival in the aftermath of trauma. The ways in which narratives of survival are very messy, irrational entities. I was fascinated by, and in some ways, this issue or this question was one of the things that really pushed me to think more about these war brides, about the multiple post-war communities that these war brides operated in. And as we'll talk about when we look at these men and women, that they often are part of multiple communities at the same time. They're part of these military communities and these veteran communities alongside DP, survivor, refugee communities as well. And then what I hoped to do too was to throw into relief how at different moments in time the war brides offered one way for multiple circles and networks to talk about matters of marriage, immigration, and citizenship. Because at the core, like at the center of these deliberations was an understanding that if a member of the American military or the Canadian military or the British military were to marry one of these survivors, that first, that survivor would have an opportunity to immigrate sooner than other individuals to the US, Britain, or Canada, and that second, that individual would become a citizen more easily than their sort of counterparts. And citizenship laws change over time, and again, happy to get into the weeds of that. But there was a recognition that part of the approval of the marriage process would mean more than the officiating of a wedding ceremony on German soil or Belgian soil or Czech soil, that it also would have implications for immigration and citizenship. And here is I love this photo. This is Isaac Rose, who marries Leisha, and they meet on the lines of fighting. So in the end, after over a decade of research, and more than a decade of research, and thinking about the different ways in which I could write this book, and some of you in this room were with me in that journey of like figuring out, well, do I have a section on Canada and a section on the US? Like, how do I start, right? And how do I end? It became clear that the way to do it would be to sort of tell the narrative using these 5 moments, right? Liberation, because I really did want to foreground liberation as the beginning of the experience. And one could imagine that there could have been other starting points, right? Like, should I start with the wartime experiences? Like, where does one start? Do I start with the moment of encounter, right? So liberation, encounter, courtship and marriage, immigration, and immigration was really 2 chapters because I talk about exclusion, and we'll talk about that too, and then their early lives. So when they get to the US, Britain, Canada, or perhaps somewhere else. And to do that, I decided that it was really significant to me, and this kind of comes back to where I started. It was really important to me that I write a book that would speak to kind of scholarly significance, but also be something that the people that I spent so much time with interviewing would want to read. And so I sort of ended up choosing a number of different couples, and happy to talk later about how I chose them, but choosing a number of different couples as a way to kind of tell the story, as a way to give like structure to the narrative arc. And today, kind of moving ahead, I'll focus on 2 of those couples to kind of walk us through the arc of the book. Rather than just delving into one chapter, I'll try to give us like the greatest hits with 2 couples. And the couples that we'll look at are 2 couples that I like using, and in every chapter, I try to have 2 couples that would throw into relief similarities and differences. So Florey and Harry Jagoda, and Sala and Abe Bonder. And part of why I like putting these 2 couples side by side is that one ends up in Canada and one ends up in the United States. Part of why I like having these 2 is that Florey grows up in a Serbo-Croatian family and speaks Ladino, and for her, part of her experience around being a war bride was being thrust into a very Ashkenazic Yiddish-speaking network and what that meant for her. And so having those 2, and Sala begins her life in Poland, and we'll show that journey in a moment. I also like it because in some settings, these are 2 couples that might be familiar. So Florey Jagoda was a very well-known musician and Ladino folk singer, and if any of you sang the Ocho Candelicas song or had children who sang that, right, that's Florey. And Sala and Abe Bonder, any Montrealers in the room, and I know there are 2 of you at least, and any Montrealers in the room, right, Bonder's Books was, and kind of still is, but a little bit less so now, kind of the bookstore outside of McGill. It was known as sort of a very sort of politicized space, and so often, depending on where I go, often these are 2 couples that resonate with individuals because they may know of Bonder's Books if they grew up or ever spent time in Montreal, or they know of Florey Jagoda. So as I mentioned, right, and Florey Kabia Jagoda is born in Sarajevo, but really grows up with her mother and stepfather in Zagreb, and with the invasion of Yugoslavia, she, separately from her mother, they split up, goes to Split, which was under Italian occupation. The hope was under Italian occupation, Jews would fare better. There are anti-Jewish laws implemented in Split. The family is forcibly deported to Kursula, an island that has 2 large detention centers on it. They're in the family-based detention center, and Florey and her mother are evacuated by a group of partisans to Bari, Italy. And they are, eventually Michael, her stepfather, is brought there as well. But when they arrive in Bari, the city of Bari is under British occupations, but the surrounding region is still contested. And so liberation is a very kind of uneven moment. Flori had picked up some Italian when she was at the detention center, but she and her mother arrive in Bari, and this is as the DP centers are being established in Bari and its environs. So that moment is itself a really fascinating moment, and happy to talk about it because it's sort of some of the decisions that are made in Bari that really kind of shape the American, British, Canadian, and even Jewish brigade decisions to do the DP camps differently in other parts of Europe later in the war. But Sala Solarts, she's actually experiencing her 36th month of confinement when Flori experiences her quote-unquote liberation. So she is impacted by the war literally on day one because she is born in Sieradz, Poland, so kind of almost on the lines of the invasion. She and her family flee to Warsaw, and as you can see from the map and the back and forth of the map, that she is sort of sent to multiple ghettos, detention camps, and then at the very end of the war, she is part of a death march, and she is liberated by Soviet soldiers outside of Dresden, sort of in between Dresden and Auschwitz in Saxony. So then, when we think about liberation, Sala and Flori have really different liberation narratives. Flori experiences her liberation much earlier than Sala. When she is liberated, the war is still ongoing, and it will be several months until Bari and its environs are secured. It will be sort of late December, early January by the time that the Foggia airfields are firmly under British control. Sala is liberated by Soviet soldiers in Germany. She has, like Flori, none of the languages with which she can sort of speak with her quote-unquote liberators. And for Flori, she decides to stay in Bari in 43. Now, some of that is because there's nowhere for them to go, right? Much of Italy is not yet under Allied control. But even once Italy becomes under Allied control, Flori and her family decide to stay in Bari. She has found a job at the British Depot Center. She was an incredibly attractive young woman and felt quite strongly that it was based on that alone that she got this job. She had no English, so she wasn't of much use as a typist, but she, like many women, received sort of positions at the bases, and there's a question sort of as to the motivation of the military that placed them there. And sometimes it's about kind of safety, and sometimes it's not about safety. Sometimes it's about kind of taking advantage. But for Flori, right, she's in Bari. She's able to earn enough, as is her stepfather, that they don't have to live in the DP camps. Sala is in Auschwitz. She is desperate to get out of the Soviet territories, in part because one of the few women who are part of their group is sexually assaulted by a Soviet soldier. And so as soon as that woman recovers, they try to go to an American or British controlled zone, and they are able to get to Hamburg. And she tries actually in the summer of 45 to escape Germany and go to Palestine, but she's caught and she's returned to the DP camp. So that she has a fair bit of movement in Germany, constantly trying to figure out, where strategically she will be best sort of situated to get herself to Palestine. Florey is in Italy and is pretty unclear and uncertain as to where they'll go next. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not the family should go back to Yugoslavia. They learned that the family's company has been sort of taken over, and so they're concerned about that. So they're sort of treading water, essentially, in Italy, whereby Sala is very much on the move throughout this period. And it's kind of for both of them that it's in that liberation moment when they have their encounters. Now, for some of the encounters, and I alluded to Gerda Weissman-Klein and Leisha Rose earlier, for some of the encounters, they take place literally kind of as the fighting is happening, or kind of at that moment of the liberation of the camps or the freeing of a group of women. For Sala and Florey, encounter doesn't take place in that context, but takes place in sort of these Jewish narratives or Jewish spaces, right? And part of what fascinated me about encounter and courtship was the ways in which, not always, but often, they had to do with finding Jews in spaces that were assumed to be without Jews, right? And so both of them, and this is where they kind of come together nicely too, both of them have a Jewish holiday meeting narrative. And it's very common for couples to meet in Zionist youth circles, at services in reconstructed synagogues. And Florey and Harry meet one another during the Jewish holidays, when Harry goes back to her parents' home to actually ask permission to take her out on a date. And he sees the machzor right on the table. The other couple, the Bonders, they meet, at this moment of Rosh Hashanah services where Florey is sort of removing herself. Sala is removing herself because she, as she often said, she didn't like it when soldiers came because she felt like they were looking at her like monkeys in a zoo, right? She didn't want to be pitied. She didn't want to be observed. And so she removes herself, but Abe sort of plops himself down and starts talking to her in Yiddish. And part of the encounter stories were stories where there was, at least on reflection, and that's something that I try to talk about in the book, at least on reflection, a sort of Jewish story, a recognition of two Jews, right, in a sea of an attempted genocide. And we'll talk maybe in the Q&A, but I only look at the couples that eventually marry. And so because of that, most of the couples that I look at are endogamous. And we'll see, as we get to courtship and marriage, that when couples decide to marry, right, courtship was sort of on their own terms and speed, but when they petition to marry, right, that would get vetted first by their commanders and very often by their chaplains. And during the Second World War, there's a role for chaplaincy in the vetting of these couples that changes during the Korean War for the Americans, and it changes in the late 50s and early 60s for the British and the Canadians. So on the whole, we have endogamous marriages, Catholics marrying Catholics, Protestants marrying Protestants, Jews marrying Jews. There are exceptions to the rule always, but most of the couples that I look at are going to be Jews who marry Jews. I could probably have written a book about the couples that never made it, right? But the couples that made it are going to often be endogamous, and so for them, their encounters and their courtships are going to have a Jewish element to them. And so where do they often have courtship experiences? Well, they'll be at the DP circles. They'll be in Zionist youth meetings. They'll be going to the Hakshara, the sort of one kind of a transnational Zionist kind of circle and element. They'll be at these new synagogue centers that are established by the Jewish Welfare Board. So the courtships often will have sort of some narrative of Jewish landscape to them, and it will be relatively quickly that they decide to marry. And very often that's because of the threat that the military personnel is going to be moved elsewhere, or that he or she will be demobilized. And there's a calendar, right? There's a period of which, if they don't get engaged and they don't have permission to become engaged, they're going to lose that window to immigrate as a war bride or war fiance. So there's a reason why many of them become engaged within a week or within a month or within a few weeks. It's because they recognize that they're not going to be able to control how quickly they marry. And we can talk about the different marriage laws. They depend on time and place. But that there's a real benefit to marrying. So our couples then find that if they marry, or at least if they have approval to marry, because one could be a war fiance, so the marriage could happen on American, British, or Canadian soil, that there's a possibility for them to have their immigration not only sort of granted to them as a category that circumvents existing categories, so they can bypass quotas, but also that their immigration process is overseen, is taken care of. So the US, Britain, and Canada have a process by which, if the couple agrees to a publicly supported immigration process, they will first go to war bride processing centers, and there are a number of them scattered across Europe. They will get cleared at those processing centers. Very often, those are the same places where our soldiers are getting demobilized and where other refugees or DPs are also having their papers processed, but they are kept separate. There's like separate barracks for these war brides, and then they go on war bride ships or war bride trains. So what fascinated me about the immigration was that we were going to have these women and some men on planes, and in some cases trains and planes and trains and ships, with other war brides with whom they can't communicate, with demobilized soldiers, and with DPs or refugees, maybe with whom they could communicate, but who they're kept separate. And there's a whole infrastructure that is run by the International Red Cross and the Maple Club, which is out of Canada, that will begin at the processing centers, begin to train the war brides for their future lives. So there are films, there are books, there are cookbooks, there are lecture series, starting at these centers and continuing on these ships. So when my grandmother was on the Algonquin, and again, I don't know much about her experience because she refused to talk about it, only sort of giving one story, but she would have probably loved to have been with the other women with whom she could communicate, but was not, right? She was in a room with English-speaking women. She, of course, had no English. I mean, she had some French, and so she was able to speak with the French war brides. Now, not all of them, I'm looking at the time, not all of them are able to actually get their immigration papers once they get to those centers and immigrate. And in fact, part of the war bride story is the exclusion story, that there are cases where, as we move into 46 and 47, that some of the war brides who are initially granted the permission to marry and then immigration, because of the time lag, right, become to be seen suspicious, because either they themselves come from a part of the world that was seen as being communist-leaning, or their spouses are known communists, or perhaps even they themselves have participated in the communist movement. And so we have a number of really prominent exclusion cases that in the late 1940s and early 1950s become a topic of conversation in the US, Britain, and Canada. And here we have one of the most famous of those exclusion cases, the German Jewish woman, Ellen Knauf, whose case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. She's eventually granted permission to enter the US, but she's detained on Ellis Island for years. So exclusion might mean detention on Ellis Island, or detention in Halifax in Canada, or it might mean that they can never enter. And then the book ends with the early years, right? And I often say right there, there's a whole nother story to be told about like what happens after those early years, right? But for many of these individuals, they then arrive in their mostly husbands' homes. So for Bonder, in a very circuitous way, they end up in a Bonder's mother's home in Montreal. With Flory Jagoda, she ends up in Youngstown, Ohio, in this Yiddish-speaking home, where they're completely out of their element, right? And so part of what fascinated me was this interaction, and I often say, right, relationships with in-laws are contentious always, right? There's always that element, right, of bringing somebody new in, and yet, right, this was supercharged, right? This was exponentially harder, right? Because we're talking about the complications of language. We're talking about many of these families that didn't want their sons or daughters marrying abroad, right? And so, in the case of Bonder, part of the reason why it takes so long for them to get to Canada is because there had been, first, the rule that they couldn't marry because they were on German soil. Canada had that longest. And then second, because his mother was sort of really reticent to allow for her son, the minor, to get married, right? And so, and then she finds herself in her mother-in-law's home, right? And she's not an idiot, she knows, right? And so many of the letters that I was able to find were letters of these, daughters-in-law writing to their mothers-in-law saying, I know that you didn't want me to marry, but I promise I will become da-da-da-da-da, right? And they're writing in their language, because they don't often have the language shared. So those early years are going to have that sort of landscape, while at the same time, these couples are going to be toggling among and between the military personnel circles, because there's a vibrant war bride culture that is established in the US, Britain, and Canada for our mostly Protestant British war brides, but that is open to any other war bride. So there are English-speaking classes, there are cooking classes, there are parenting classes, right? Alongside the opportunities for Jewish survivors. And so very often part of the story is that navigation is sort of trying to figure out where and in what circle these couples wish to land. And so perhaps I'll kind of stop there with that kind of early moment, and then, because I think I'm at my 40-something minutes, and then open up. Am I good? Take 3 more? Okay, so then I will want to say one more thing, which is what we find as sort of the turning point for these couples, because again, they're sort of toggling among these multiple communities, will be the sort of opportunity to establish one's own homes. And so we find that in Canada and in the United States, where there is a GI Bill infrastructure that allows for our military personnel to both potentially pursue more educational opportunities, but definitely to pursue the opportunity to move into homes of their own, we see this time lag of sort of war brides beginning to talk about kind of their new lives by the late 40s and early 50s in ways that I think is distinct. It kind of takes a few more years in Britain, in part because of that, just the devastation of the housing shortage, right? And so we see a very different landscape. in terms of those early years. So perhaps I'll end there and then open up for Q&A, and I'll do whatever you are in charge. I just follow whatever you tell me to do.
All right. So we'll do Q&A now. I'm going to steal one question before we get going, while I have the opportunity. So going back to this exclusion story, and I don't, depending on when you were writing, what chapter of what book, and what year, and what was going on in the news, parts of this chapter on exclusion, especially Knopf and then this other woman, Friedel, I believe, parts of this chapter just jump off at the page, given the world that we now live in. Questions about family separation, habeas petitions, detaining immigrants, the use or the kind of weaponization of a better America, or the ideals of America, to appeal to officials to make this situation right and let these people come in. I don't know if I have a very specific question, but just kind of curious about your reflections of this story of exclusion, the kind of in the echoes in this chapter, as a part of just a larger story about immigration in America and people trying to get in. I was just curious if you had any connections or thoughts or ideas about that.
No, absolutely, and add to it surveillance, right? Because so much of the materials for both couples that I draw on in that chapter come from the surveillance materials, because both couples are under surveillance for different periods of time. That chapter was really difficult to write, in part because we still use the Knopf case, and some of you may be lawyers in the room, but that's still part of our precedential corpus in the United States around the question of when one detains an immigrant, what rights that immigrant has. So Ellen Knopf is detained at Ellis Island, so she arrives at Ellis Island, and she doesn't know why she's being detained. And so at the core of the case is this question of, does an immigrant have the right to even understand why that person is being detained? And the Supreme Court says no, the person does not have the right to learn, and that still gets cited. So for me, when I began this work and I started first just applying for the Freedom of Information Appeal access for her case, and I kept getting rejected. And I was like, what is it about this? There's nothing about it. She's a war bride. Why would anyone care? And then, of course, the light comes up. Of course, yes, right. Of course, there's people care. Because there was so much about this question of what is the responsibility of the infrastructure of immigration towards the immigrant, right? And that's part of the narrative of Ellen Knopf's story, and it's part of Friedel Rosenthal's story too, where she and James never sue for the right for her to come to the U.S. Ellen is on a ship when the decision is made that, in fact, she should not have been put on the ship in the first place, and that's why she's detained at Ellis Island. Friedel is told in Frankfurt that her papers have been rescinded and that she can no longer go to the U.S. And so she makes a strategic decision to go to England, where her sister had gone in the 1930s as part of the Kindertransport. And so because of that, she can come to England as part of, and she's a survivor of one of the death camps. So she fits the sort of, if you will, targeted categories of British immigration policy vis-a-vis Holocaust survivors. And Friedel's story is a bit more complicated because she has her and James's daughter in tow. So Valerie is born in Frankfurt in 1946, and Friedel has no one to help her, and so she decides that it's just going to make more sense to get out of Germany and to go to England. James actually leaves the United States, becomes sort of a communist cause célèbre. He's like the love child of many communist newspapers at the time. He's everywhere because he very publicly renounces the U.S., gets on a plane, goes to England, where he continues to write against the Americans, becomes part of this anti-fascist circle in London. He's sort of a fascinating guy, and he never is able to get permission for Friedel to come to the U.S. And he petitions a number of times for them to go to the U.S. and throughout the 50s he's rejected, and eventually they stay in England. And he travels to the U.S. a few times. He actually had been previously married. He's not the most sympathetic of characters, which partly makes me love him more, because when they're completely sympathetic and you just want to hug them, right, in some ways they're less interesting to write about, right? And Friedel and James are very complicated. And so that's partly what is so kind of delightful and interesting about their story. So he comes back to visit his sons from his first marriage twice, and he's allowed back in and he's allowed to leave again. But absolutely, the immigration stuff really resonated.
And even just, this line, which just leaps out of the book from the House Judiciary Subcommittee, Francis Walter, talking about Ellen's case, and says it's outrageous, and quote, "Some clerk somewhere has made a mistake which no one had the courage to admit to fix the problem."
Yeah.
I just.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And in fact, right, that's part of what becomes so interesting about the Ellen Knopf story, is that it's not really clear that, I mean, James is a communist. Like, he is a card-carrying, subscription-selling communist, right? Like, I have no problem with that, but the State Department did. Ellen, it's less clear that she has any strong communist leanings whatsoever. I mean, so it is very possible that a mistake kind of had been made, and when you look at some of this material that is heavily redacted, and so you're kind of holding up the thing, trying to see if you can see through anything, it is very possible that somebody just screwed something up, and because of that screw up, she is detained on Ellis Island.
Let's open it up. Any questions?
Totally different subject, but I'm just curious. I grew up with a bunch of Holocaust survivors, I think many of us probably did. Were there any like local clubs in different cities where, and where the Jewish war brides? So I'm sure cliques, not cliques, that's not the right word, but families hung out together, so much in common. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question. Can I ask your name?
Carol.
Carol. Thank you so much, Carol, for the question. It's such a great one. So yes, so there are, and I try to talk about this a little bit in the last chapter of the book. So there are non-Jewish war bride clubs. And there are, in some cities, and again, many of our Jewish war brides find themselves in cities because they're marrying Jewish military personnel who are more likely to end up in cities. But there are some cities where we have multiple war bride clubs. You might have a French war bride club and a British war bride club, etc. And then we have different kind of survivor circles, networks, including like Landsmannschaften, depending on, that might be language oriented. In some cities, we have Jewish war bride clubs. They're actually more prominent in Canada, where there's an infrastructure that supports them. So Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver all have some Jewish war bride clubs. There's a tension that I write about in the last chapter of the book. So a number of the Jewish women's groups are ambivalent about these Jewish war brides. And some of that ambivalence has to do with the fact that they're often being asked to be the sort of mentors and the guides to these Jewish war brides. And so there's a responsibility there. Some of them are ambivalent because they've spent the war sending care packages and letters to the men that they thought they might marry, and then they find, right, that these men have married someone else. So one of my favorite couples, again, I like the messy ones, right? But one of my favorite couples is Daniel and Clara Isaacman. And Daniel, part of the reason why I love Daniel is he writes to his mother every single day. I mean, who doesn't love somebody who writes to his mother every day? His father too, but really, I think about it as his mother. So Daniel writes to his mother every day, and his parents are writing these letters like, we just had, your girlfriend over for Shabbat dinner, Daniel. Like, who is this Clara person, right? So, and then Daniel and Clara, his wife, come to Philadelphia, and the ex-fiance girlfriend, right, is in the same community. So there's a way in which there's really, and there's a messiness to these circles. And I don't want to suggest that the survivor circles were by definition neat, right? That's not my point at all. But I do think that the liminality, the in-betweenness of these Jewish war brides just adds an additional kind of thorn or ripple to all of this. Thank you, Carol. That was such a good question.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for such a wonderful, congratulations on such a wonderful
Thanks.
book. I have a question about, it's almost an ethical narrative question. I was thinking about how in the course of your preparing this book, there was a flurry of writing about sexual violence in Allied soldiers during the liberation process and the end of fighting. And I was wondering how you, having read the book, I know how you navigate some of that literature, and but I'm curious if you could talk through how you thought through how to frame these stories, and if there were, you described the discomfort of some of the cases that you explore in thinking about them as ethical encounters, as risky encounters, power dynamic between the soldiers and the women, and so forth.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sarah. And it's, it's hard to imagine having been able to write this book 3 decades ago, right? I relied so heavily on the scholarship of others who really kind of helped me think through so many of these questions. So there are kind of multiple spokes, I guess, to the answer to your question. Perhaps at the center, right, of that bicycle spoke was my desire not to romanticize these couples, to understand that there is a power dynamic to them, and that these couples are going to always be wrestling with that power dynamic. And in fact, I have this article that's coming out in Genocide and Holocaust Studies that kind of looks exactly at this question of how do they use emotions to kind of name their uneasiness with the power dynamic that's at the core of their relationships. Because for these women, there was value. They may have gotten preferable housing, jobs, immigration paperwork, right? And for the men, there may have been other opportunities. Perhaps there was a sexual partner. Perhaps it was an opportunity to feel as if they are repaying or helping to do some sort of good in a sea of evil. For our refugee soldiers, there's a dynamic that is, almost cringy to read, right? When they say things like, you are my sister, you are my mother, right? You understand what my sister went through. So there's all of that kind of dynamic. And so it was important for me not to romanticize, but also to do the work that we do of the both and, right? Of the listening to the words of the people that we're working with, and appreciating and sitting with those words and questioning. And for me, especially when I was doing interviews, it was very important that my interviewees always knew that whatever they told, like if there was something they told me that they did not want it in the book, it would not be in the book. And that I would share that with their, that I would share whatever they wanted shared before. And there were conversations that I had with some of my interviewees where we talked very frankly about matters of sex that they asked not to have in the book, and I completely understood why. I thought Flory was so, in some ways, it was such a gift that she was one of my first interviewees, because she had been interviewed so many times before about other things, but she had a sort of a comfort level with just being interviewed, so that there was a way in which she gave me some of the language first that I then could use when I was asking, so that I could. So I often used sort of her framing about discomfort around some of the soldiers, and yeah. So there were other ethical. I mean, there were so many, right? This is something that we deal with always as historians, right? When we open up a box of materials and we think like, ooh, are we really meant to be? Like, should we be reading this? Like, is this stuff that we should be reading? And this was all over the place, particularly in some of the chaplaincy papers, right? Where where I learned about, children that may or may not have known about, so there's a lot of, and so trying to figure out and talking to the archivists, and asking questions. So I was very frequently relying on the work of friends who are ethicists and asking them, like, what should I be doing? What would you do? Oh.
Okay.
Carol, yes.
You might have mentioned this and I may have missed it. How many couples did you interview for? And then I also have a very tangent question about the settlement cookbook and how it was used maybe with some of these.
Oh yeah, so they actually create their own. There's the war brides have their own cookbooks. So there are these war bride very trafe, lots of Jell-O cookbooks kind of thing. So I interviewed 15 or 16. Trying to remember, war brides, 3, if we want to call them grooms. I was lucky enough to interview 2 nurses who had worked on the war bride ships. That was really spectacular. And then there were a number of children that I was able to interview. Many of the interviews never made it into the book because I made the decision to focus on certain couples. So all of the interviews helped. It's just not all of them make their way into the book.
I'm wondering if you got a feeling for how many of these matches were what we might call love matches today, and whether a significant number of these were really, well, this is a nice Jewish boy, I'm in a terrible place, and I get to go to Canada or the U.S.
So thank you. Tell me your name.
Jake,
thank you. So Jay, that's it again. It's so hard because we're looking at the materials from the time. What I can say is that in real time, the couples are leaving a archive to suggest that it is a love match, which they may be doing because they may know that there's a lot of pushback in the air around these couples and the women using their sexuality to gain entree to the U.S., Britain, or Canada, right? So there's a way in which, in real time, they're writing letters to one another, saying things like, those other marriages, those other couples, like, they don't know what love is, but we do, right? Does that mean that they were really in love? Like, oh. But certainly they're invested at that moment to leaving some sort of legacy. It may not even be a legacy. It may be like at the moment of putting pen to paper, right? Instead of writing something into sand, writing it into stone. That they are kind of imprinting an impulse that, again, I can't read. I don't know how to read whether or not it's authentic or not authentic. I'm sure, I mean, I talk about this elsewhere, but I think it's a cluster of emotions, right? And there's multiple things at play. And I think, love is a tricky thing, as we all know. And with it, right, these couples, many of whom stay together, and that may or may not mean because they're in love, right? It may also be that divorce was very much frowned upon in the 40s and 50s. And really, who's going back to Poland, right? Like in 1950, when the American and Canadian Red Cross create an opportunity for war brides to go back, right? And they do that because there are these two incredible, nothing to do with Jews, but two incredible murder cases. One in Canada, one in the U.S. In Canada, the war bride murders her husband. In the U.S., the husband, the veteran, murders the war bride. And so the Red Cross basically says, okay, anyone who wants to go back, we will pay for them to go back, right? And there are hundreds of British women who return, right? They leave, it's like 125 or something, so 100 plus. They leave, Saskatchewan, nothing against Saskatchewan, or they leave, somewhere in Iowa, nothing against Iowa, right? And they go back to London. But these Jewish survivors, they're not going back to Poland. So it's hard to know how to read these marriages, in terms of love match.
Well, I hesitated to ask a question because I've had plenty of chances to ask you since I interviewed you and wrote about your book. But I'm assuming you're not going to do the spoiler. But I'll give you a question you can decide if you want to spoil it for people who haven't read the book yet. But if your family's story, because you kind of sprinkled these nuggets throughout your talk for the Q&A, so I'm going to grab one of them.
You can.
And so having this personal connection, I would imagine, creates obstacles or challenges, but also opportunities in a way, right? And I'm wondering if it would probably be a different book if somebody who wasn't descended from this kind of marriage had written it, right? So it's a personal story for you. You said you were doing both the kind of family research at the same time as you were doing the broader research on these other couples and on the legal structures that contain them and different sort of Holocaust and post-Holocaust mobilities and trajectories. So I'm just wondering what, reflecting back now a little while after you finished the book, how do you make sense of the sort of personal piece and the scholarly piece and how they fit together and what kind of ways in which your relationship to the material made it a very particular kind of project?
Well, I certainly think that some of the delays or the starts and stops of writing the book had to do with my own kind of personal engagement with the material. Like just in terms of my own kind of personally, right? That there was a way in which it was sort of two steps forward sometimes and one step back, or kind of trying to make sense of realizing it's like that moment that I think many of us have had in the room, like when we realize that our parents are real people. So similarly, right, all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, So there certainly was that element. There also was the So when I started the book, and you know my husband, or met him, but so when I started the book, my husband said to me, like, so does this mean that you're going to research, that you're going to finally do the research on your own family? And I was like, absolutely not, because my father and my grandmother told me not to, so I will not, right? And I started that, and then of course, I realized, like, no, I needed to know. And so I actually wrote 2 conclusions, and I sent them both to my siblings and to my parents. And I've written to, and I had to do it this way because I knew that what I didn't want to do was put my father in a position where I said to him, like, here's the conclusion I wrote, do you like it? Like, that seemed to me to put him in an untenable, uncomfortable, that was unfair. And so I wrote 2 different conclusions, and I essentially said to my siblings and to my parents, I've written 2 conclusions. I'd actually like to use the conclusion that has our family's history in it, but I appreciate the reasons why we haven't spoken about our family history. So let me know what you think. And I am totally okay with using this other conclusion. Like, this other conclusion is good. And my siblings my sister wrote, texted immediately and said, whatever dad says is great with me, love you, you're brilliant, like my sister. My brother, I eventually had to hunt him down and say, like, did you get it? My mother said, it's up to your dad. And my father, who is like an engineer, some of you may be engineers in the room. If so, I apologize. But my father's an engineer. And he said, I will tell you in 2 weeks. And he's a Yeka and an engineer. So 13 days later, he called me and he said, I never thought about the story. I'm glad that you've kind of made me think about it. You can use that conclusion. You can use any images you want. That's great. And I said to him, that's amazing. Do you want me to share all the materials that I have from ITS and elsewhere? And he said, no. So we kind of have done this sort of navigating, and I'll be really curious. I mean, so next week I'm speaking at Lair House in Boston, and I'm going to be interviewed by my son, my eldest. He's going to be my interlocutor, and my parents have announced that they're coming, and part of the conversation is about trauma and family and writing. And I said to my dad, like, love that you're coming. You know that this is sort of being framed as, and my dad's like, yeah, I'm sort of ready. So I don't know if that means I'm ready and I'm going to like stand up and sit with you guys and we'll have a conversation, or if that means more like his personality, I'm ready and I'll hide in the corner of the room. But it has been, for me, it's definitely been part of the journey.
Any other questions?
Have you also studied couples with women who were not war brides, that were both sides had lost all their families and they met in a refugee camp or a displaced persons camp, and they got married and started new families? Have you done any of those studies? And are there any books on that?
So tell me your name. Verna, thank you. So happily, there's really great work on that. And depending on like which DP camp you're interested in, we can get to that kind of granular level of materials, but I'm happy to give you some suggestions. There's both sort of articles and books around individuals, couples that marry in the DP camps, have children. There's materials, Margaret Feinstein, for example, writes about kind of the family cultures of these families, like what their religious lives are like, kinds of the cultural artifacts. So, and in fact, and I should have kind of given her attribution, when I even thought about writing what I thought would be an article, because I had an idea for my next book. It was not going to be this originally. And I thought, I'll write an article about these Jewish war brides in Germany. And so I called Tina Grossman, and said, what do you know? Because she's one of these authors that you should read. Jews, Germans, Allies is her book, where she talks about some of these people, and elsewhere she writes about these. And I said to Atina, what do you know about them? Is it worth pursuing them? And she basically said, they're not my people. And by that she meant, once these war brides become war brides or war fiancés, they're not considered DPs. They're not considered refugees. They are war brides. They have their own category. There are policies that concern them. And so their lives take this different trajectory, and that's partly why I wanted to study them, because some people, not Atina, not Margaret, they haven't done this, some scholars just kind of squish them into the DPs or immigrants, but they're not. They're not living in the same spaces. They have different opportunities. And so I wanted to kind of make sure that we saw them as they were in this kind of panoply of experiences in the aftermath of the war.
Any other questions?
I should say as an aside, I know it's sort of weird that I ask people's names, but I find that when you study attempted genocide and you think about, and you spend so much time thinking about people's humanity, there's so much of our humanity has to do with our names. And so I appreciate that it may be unusual, but it's important to me when we're having a conversation that I can kind of attribute, whether it's Jay or Carol or Neen, your names. So thank you.
Anyone else? All right, well, let's thank Professor Judd for joining us. Congratulations on a book.